In this video, you'll learn how to calibrate the spectrometer of the Horiba LabRAM Raman microscope at the Molecular Foundry. On the first page of the Quick Start manual, you'll find a reference to the Horiba LabSpec manual. Go to the page number specified in the manual. You can find the LabSpec manual by going to the desktop of the Raman computer and double-clicking on the icon in the upper right corner of the desktop. Firefox will open up, and then you can view the PDF inside of Firefox. As directed by the manual, go to page 247 of the LabSpec PDF. There you can find detailed instructions on how to calibrate the wavelength of the spectrometer for the LabRAM Aramis microscope. The basic idea of calibration is that you're going to change two software parameters, the zero value and also the coef value. You're going to adjust these two free parameters so that a Raman spectrum of silicon gives you a 0 wave number shift for your laser line and a 520.7 wave number shift for the main silicon Raman peak. So the first thing you need to do is actually focus on a piece of silicon. Usually there's a piece of silicon lying inside of the Raman spectrometer on a glass slide. You're going to focus using a 50x or 100x objective, and then you're going to select the diffraction grating that you wish to calibrate. So it doesn't matter which laser you use, but the calibration is always tied to a specific grating. The first thing you'll do is calibrate the zero order position. To go to the zero order of the grating, you'll go to the spectrometer toolbar in LabSpec, and you'll click on the left-hand arrow. Note this is not the same as typing 0 wave numbers or 0 nanometers in the text field. You must use the left arrow in the spectrometer box. Once you click the left arrow, you'll see the numbers in the wave number box change until you see a 0 followed by parentheses and brackets. After that, click on the RTD icon to bring up a live spectrum. You should see a sharp peak near 0 wave numbers, but if your spectrometer is not calibrated correctly, this peak will not be exactly at 0 wave numbers. So to adjust the calibration, you can go to the Setup menu and choose Instrument Calibration. There you'll see the Instrument Calibration dialog box, and you want to change the 0 parameter. I like to change the last 2 digits up or down by 10 units, and then I'll see which way that moves the peak. You want to move the peak so it's centered at 0 wave numbers, and sometimes that means zooming in on the peak so you can actually see the fine changes. You can click on the arrow cursor on the left-hand toolbar. You can click anywhere on the graph to view the x-axis coordinate for that particular point. So if you use the left and right arrow keys, you can view how far away your peak is from 0 nanometers. So your instrument calibration window is still open as the RTD is running. So you can adjust the 0 parameter up or down until your peak is located directly on top of 0. So the system is considered well calibrated if your peak is within 1 click of the left or right arrow keys to 0 nanometers. After you change the 0 value, remember to click Apply to move the spectrum. Now, after you've roughly adjusted the peak position, you want to click the left arrow in the spectrometer box again. That's going to recenter the grating to its 0 mode, and then sometimes that will shift the peak a little bit. And so you'll repeat the process of adjusting the 0 parameter, watching the peak move, and then re-zeroing the spectrometer until you no longer see the peak move when you click the left arrow. So this is looking pretty good. We'll test it one more time just to be sure. So you can see here how the 2 points or pixels at the top of the peak straddle the 0 nanometer line, and so that way I know that the 0 parameter is set. Now that we've adjusted the 0 parameter, we'll move on to the coef parameter. The coef parameter is tuned relative to the silicon Raman peak at 520.7 wave numbers, so we'll first center the spectrometer on 520.7 wave numbers. So I type in 520.7 in the wave number box in the spectrometer settings, and then I press enter, which causes the gratings to move. So then I press the RTD button to view a live spectrum, and then I can auto scale to see the actual peaks. So if my intensities are low, I can adjust the filter to optimize the signal, and then I can auto scale again. I'm going to zoom in on the silicon Raman peak around 520.7 wave numbers, and then I'll use the arrow cursor tool to move around and see exactly where my peak is. And so I can see that my peak is not exactly at 520.7, it's about 519 wave numbers, so a couple wave numbers too low. So I can open up the instrument calibration menu or dialog box by going to the setup menu and then choosing instrument calibration. In the instrument calibration dialog box, you're going to change the coef parameter, which is the bottom parameter. Just like we did for the 0 parameter, we're going to change the last 2 digits. In this case, we're going to bump up the second to last digit by 1 or subtract 1. Remember to click Apply to change the parameters, then you can watch how the spectrum changes. If the spectrum changes in the opposite direction, then move the coef parameter in the opposite direction. So you can use the cursor tool to verify that your peak is centered at 520.7, and you can make smaller and smaller changes to the coef parameter until it's centered at 520.7. So the peak is considered calibrated when it's within 1 pixel of 520.7 wave numbers. Here the cursor value, which you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, says the peak is at 520.48, which is within 1 pixel of our target 520.7 value. So our spectrometer is well calibrated. It's also worth double checking that the laser peak, which should be at 0 wave numbers, is in fact at 0 wave numbers. So when we zoom in on the laser peak, we indeed see that the peak is within 1 step of the 0 wave number target. So at this point, we're done with our calibration. You can stop the RTD mode, and then you'll note in the logbook that you calibrated a specific grating. Here are some additional tips and precautions. Generally, you shouldn't have to move the grating very far. If you can't see the 0 peak or the 520 peak, there's usually something wrong and you should contact the Raman administrator immediately. It's also worthwhile to note or write down somewhere the old 0 or coef settings. That way, if you get too far away and you lose your place, then you can always go back to the old settings. So that is wavelength calibration for the Raman microscope. In general, the microscope tends to keep its calibration within a couple of wave numbers over the course of weeks, but if you're trying to get reliable data for a publication or to compare across the weeks, then you want to calibrate before doing any kind of measurement.